Biology 1010, presentation number 5, photosynthesis. Most of us know that photosynthesis is the process by which plants make their own food molecules. Most of us might even go so far as to know that the sun is the source of energy to make those food molecules, and there is a requirement for carbon dioxide and even a requirement for water. But in this presentation, our job is to actually go beyond that. So let's take a look at some general aspects of photosynthesis. It is a process of anabolism. You might remember that anabolism or anabolic reactions are processes by which something is made, and in this case we're making food molecules. Now for the plant, that food molecule is an energy-containing compound that we commonly refer to as sugar, and also known as carbohydrate, is produced by the plant in order to do a number of different things. Keep the plant alive, allow the plant to grow, and allow the plant to reproduce. So we're taking the sun's energy, we're capturing it, and we're storing it in this food molecule. And we've already mentioned there are 3 basic ingredients: sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. But we need to know what those ingredients represent. We're building a food molecule, so we need a source of energy, which is the sunlight, the energy which we will store in that food molecule. We need carbon atoms to construct the food molecule, and that's what carbon dioxide is. It's our source of carbon atoms. Carbon dioxide is a ready form of carbon available as a gas in our air. And then finally, water, which is our source of electrons. In order to hold and keep that energy in the structure of a food molecule, we need to energize those electrons. Electrons are absolutely critical for holding the energy in that food molecule. So sunlight, source of energy; carbon dioxide, source of carbon; and water, source of electrons. What else do we need to know about photosynthesis? It's carried out by plants, but also by a large number of organisms called algae, which are members of the kingdom Protista. They live primarily in aquatic environments, both freshwater and marine environments. They are photosynthetic as well. To be honest with you, some bacteria are, but for your purposes, you'll want to remember that plants and algae are our photosynthetic organisms. To do photosynthesis, you require photocollectors. Now, in a presentation on cells, which wasn't too long ago, we learned there were these organelles called chloroplasts, and their job is to absorb sunlight and to harness that energy. So plants and algae require chloroplasts, organelles that contain photosynthetic pigments, special colored chemical compounds, and those chemical compounds not only reflect light, in other words, they look green because they're reflecting green light, but what they don't reflect, they absorb. And what they absorb is the energy in that light. And what they absorb is going to be used to energize those electrons, which will be held in those food molecules. So what do these food molecules do? We mentioned this not too long ago. They are used by the plant to sustain the life of the plant, to provide energy for the plant to grow, to provide energy for the plant to reproduce. But the importance of photosynthesis goes beyond the individual plant. So let's take a look at what's involved here. We see that photosynthesis makes a sugar molecule. I've got the illustration of the obligatory glucose molecule smack dab in the middle of this illustration. I see that sugar molecule can be used as a source of energy for manufacturing ATP, which we know is cellular fuel. And it's the ATP that will be used to fuel the life of the plant, fuel the growth of the plant, fuel the reproduction of the plant. Now, the plant has also the option of storing that sugar, and storing that sugar in the form of a polysaccharide. So we learned that in the presentation on biomolecules. And so at the lower right on the illustration, you see a molecule of starch, which is technically the storage form of this food molecule in the plant. And so that starch can be stored for periods of time when there is no available sunlight, because even though the sun rises and the sun sets, and there are some seasons where there is plenty of available sunlight, there are plenty of times where there is no consistent sunlight available. It doesn't change the fact that that plant still needs a source of ATP to stay alive, to grow, to reproduce, and that's the job that starch provides for the plant. But perhaps the most important thing is, let's take a look at the little picture of the deer inset at the bottom left. Every single animal on this face of the planet ultimately depends upon plants as their source of energy. Plants are capable of making their own food molecules. Animals are not, which means an animal must obtain its food molecule in some prepackaged form. That's why some animals eat plants. And then again, of course, there are some animals that eat other animals. But generally, if you're a carnivore and you're an animal that eats another animal, what you are consuming is probably an herbivore, which is an animal that has eaten a plant. In any event, every single organism in the ecosystem ultimately is going to be somewhat dependent on plants doing photosynthesis. Every single organism in the ecosystem, Dr. Knauss, even bacteria and fungi? Well, if you think about it, bacteria and fungi decompose things. They're getting their food molecules of something that was once alive, which is now is dead. But the thing is that thing that was once alive now is dead was either an animal or a plant. And once again, the food molecules that are being consumed in this case by the fungus or by the bacteria is ultimately produced through a process of photosynthesis by a plant somewhere, somehow. So we're making sugar, carbohydrate, which can be used to fuel the needs of the plant at the present. You can actually store that food as starch for later use, or that food molecule can be consumed and passed up the food web through herbivores and through carnivores. If we're going to go into photosynthesis in detail, let's start with the nature of light. Light comes from the sun. Gotta admit, there is some light that comes from other sources in the universe, stars and things like that, but the far majority of light that strikes our planet comes from our sun. And all of that light qualifies as something that's more officially known as electromagnetic radiation. Now, electromagnetic radiation comes in a lot of different forms. If you take a look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see a wide range of what constitutes electromagnetic radiation. This is energy radiating from the sun. It begins with low energy, long wave radiation, including radio waves at the far end, going to microwaves, going to infrared radiation, which you and I ordinarily associate with as heat. There's visible light, smack dab in the middle. Then there's ultraviolet light. Then there's shorter wavelength radiation and high energy radiation, which would run from X-rays to gamma rays. And I think you realize that those forms of electromagnetic radiation on the right-hand side of the spectrum, as we look at it, constitute the most dangerous forms of radiation. Smack dab in the middle is that narrow section which is labeled here as visible light. And visible light is what plants use to do photosynthesis. They don't use the whole range, because obviously on the far right-hand side of the range, these forms of radiant energy are much too high energy to be able to manage. And then on the left-hand side of the spectrum, they're much lower energy forms and don't provide enough quality energy to be able to harness for the purposes of making ATP. So I need you to make sure you are aware of the different components of the electromagnetic spectrum, what constitutes long wavelength, low energy radiation on one end of the spectrum, and what constitutes short wavelength, high energy radiation on the other side of the spectrum. Might want to know radio waves, microwaves, infrared radiation, visible light, ultraviolet light, X-rays, and gamma rays in that order, and then smack dab in the middle, visible light, which is our source of radiant energy for photosynthesis. That narrow bit of light in the middle of the electromagnetic spectrum, what we call visible light, is actually composed of a number of different colors. Now, the colors of visible light, I mean, you all have probably learned about prisms and rainbows and things like that. The different colors of light correspond to different wavelengths. Different wavelengths have either high energy or low energy, and when we see them, they appear as different colors. So what we call the spectrum, which is the spectrum of visible light, what is white light that shines from the sun, is really a composite of these different colors. And on one end we got violet, and then blue and green and yellow and orange and red, running from low energy on the red side to high energy on the blue side, to long wavelengths on the red side and short wavelengths on the blue side. Now, this is going to be important when we start talking about how plants do photosynthesis, because we're going to find that the plant will emphasize some portions of the spectrum for absorbing light, and another portion of the spectrum will actually be reflected. So we'll see plants appear green because they reflect green light, but what they don't reflect is what they absorb to power photosynthesis. And we'll be seeing that on the next couple of slides. But right now, make sure that you know that in the middle of the electromagnetic spectrum of radiation coming from the sun, there is this narrow bit called visible light. And you'll also want to know that visible light is essentially a composite of different colors in order: violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. As a matter of fact, it's not just what I see shining through the prism there. It's what you see, the order of colors in a rainbow, because a rainbow is nothing more than a consequence of white light shining through a moisture-laden atmosphere. Gives you the same thing. It separates that white light into its composite parts. And we're going to understand that those component parts, different energy levels, and different wavelengths. And they're going to play a role in the photosynthesis process. Now that we have a handle on light, let's take a look at the chloroplasts, the photocollectors. Chloroplasts are membrane-bound organelles. They're found in plant cells. If you take a look at the photograph on the upper right, you will see what looks like a lot of little tiny little green dots in some plant cells. Those are chloroplasts. Now, chloroplasts have an internal structure. We learned about that in the presentation on cells. And the chloroplasts have these internal membranes, and the internal membranes are officially called thylakoids. Now, I apologize, that's not on this slide, so I'm going to ask you to write that down, and it's spelled Thylakoids. Strange name, thylakoids. Thylakoids. These are internal membranes found inside of the chloroplast, and they're loaded with pigments. Now, the pigments found in the chloroplast come in three different types: chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and carotenoids. And they are arranged in these clusters, much like you see in the illustration on the right immediately below the chloroplast. You see a lot of green balls there, and those green balls are these various chlorophyll molecules. They're colorful, but they're also going to absorb that sunlight. And so you see the illustration of the sun indicating the absorption of light energy by those molecules. Now, thing is I guess we could ask the question, why would a plant have multiple pigments? Chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, carotenoids. Well, we're going to answer that question in detail on the next slide. But what I want to note now is that by having multiple pigments, what the plant's able to do is maximize its ability to absorb light. If the plant only had one pigment, it might only absorb 30% of what was possible. If I was a plant, I'd be much rather absorbing 100% of available solar energy rather than just 30%. So here's the explanation. Why do I have multiple pigments? Well, we're going to find that pigments absorb light differently. Every single pigment has a unique absorption pattern. That absorption pattern is called an absorption spectrum. I like to think of it as kind of like an absorption fingerprint. Our fingerprints mark us or identify us as different people. In the world of pigments, the absorption spectrum identifies the pigment based on its unique properties of being able to absorb light. Let's take a look at the graph. Now, if I look at the graph, I notice that the y-axis, which is the one that's going up and down, is labeled amount of light absorbed. And across the bottom, the x-axis, I see wavelength. So I see the different component colors of white light. I could have violet light, blue light, green light, yellow light, orange light, and red light shining on the plant. Now, those different colors of light are going to be absorbed differently. So on that same graph, I've got a line labeled chlorophyll A, it's dark green. I've got a line labeled chlorophyll B, it's light green. I've got a line labeled carotenoids, it's yellow. And I notice that chlorophyll A absorbs fairly well in the violet range. And as I start moving from violet to blue, I see a little peak, which means the chlorophyll A is absorbing its best at that point. But then you notice that the absorption line for chlorophyll A kind of decreases almost to zero as I get to green. And it stays about zero until I get back to the red range on the far right-hand side of the graph, where I get a second peak of absorption. So in a nutshell, looking at chlorophyll A, it absorbs really well in the violet to blue range, and then again really well in the red range. But the places where it doesn't absorb so well, that's energy I'm effectively missing. So let's add chlorophyll B in the mix. If I was to use chlorophyll B alongside of chlorophyll A, I'm going to compensate for what chlorophyll A can't do. So let's take a look at chlorophyll B. Chlorophyll B, the light green line, does not seem to absorb so well in the violet range, but when I get into the blue, shifting even into the green, chlorophyll B does a heck of a lot better. And then it drops out, once again, as I get to green and yellow and even into orange, and I see a secondary peak of absorption as I move from orange to red. So in other words, chlorophyll B has its unique absorption pattern, its unique absorption fingerprint, and if I put chlorophyll B right alongside chlorophyll A, I'm absorbing more energy with the two combined than I would if I had one individually. Throw carotenoids in there. Carotenoids, as a rule, absorb fairly well in the violet and blue, but best in the green. Now, think about it. Plants reflecting green light. That's why plants look green. And so if plants are reflecting green light, that's a lot of potential energy there that the plant's missing. However, the plant's got those carotenoids. And while the plant doesn't appear to be yellow necessarily, the carotenoids are going to be engaged in absorbing some of that green light that ordinarily would be lost through a process of reflection. So the reason why we use all three pigments together is to maximize the amount of light energy we can absorb. And I see that on this particular graph. Now, what ultimately is going to happen is we're going to use that light energy to energize electrons. And so over on the right-hand side of the slide, I have kind of a little schematic showing you a non-energized electron in blue and that energized electron in yellow. And once I generate that energized electron, well, I can use that as a component of building a food molecule. And this is what plants do. They energize electrons, and they use those electrons to build food molecules. So in summary, I guess I should say that you probably want to know that plants appear green because they reflect green light, but what they don't reflect, they absorb. And in order to maximize what they absorb, we've got these different pigments. And you probably want to know that chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and carotenoids absorb light energy differently. And because they absorb light energy differently, each one by itself is not adequate to doing the best possible job. We use them all three together to maximize the amount of energy we can absorb so we can energize electrons so that we can make those food molecules. So we've got light nailed down, we've got pigments nailed down. Let's take a look at the actual process of photosynthesis. Now, we could go in a lot more detail than what we're about to. As a matter of fact, I'm going to caution you, if at some point you decide you're going to Google photosynthesis, you might wind up getting information that's a lot more complicated than you need to. So this is one of these rare cases where I'm going to suggest that you stick with the illustrations that I'm about to show you. Here's the deal. Photosynthesis is actually two different processes. It's a two-step process. And you can think of those two steps as like two factories. So I got this little illustration here showing you two factories. Factory on the left, which is called the light-dependent reaction, and factory on the right, which is called the light-independent reaction. And you see the input of sun, and you see the input of water, both go in factory number one. And then you actually see the input of carbon dioxide at factory number two. And I see the production of some oxygen. And I notice that factory number one and factory number two are linked or connected together. And then at the far right-hand side of the illustration, I see I'm cranking out glucose or sugar as a product. So we're going to understand that photosynthesis is a two-step process. Those two steps are the light-dependent reaction and the light-independent reaction. Now, to get an idea of what actually is going on, the first step in the photosynthesis process, what we call the light-dependent reaction, is commonly referred to as the light harvesting step. That's operative. That's what's going on. We're taking the sunlight that's shining on the plant and we're harvesting that energy. Now, in order to harvest that energy, I need electrons. And so that you will notice over there on the far left, you will see water coming into the process. And you might remember earlier on a slide, we said that water was a source of electrons. So there's the water. Those are the electrons coming in. That's the sunshine, which is the energy. We're going to energize those electrons, and we're going to capture that energy, and we are going to send it in the form of ATP and NADPH, labeled there in red. We're going to send that captured, harvested energy to the second factory, the light-independent reaction, where we're going to use that energy to weld carbon atoms together to make that glucose molecule. Now, this is why we call the second factory's operation carbon fixation. Carbon fixation means I'm going to take carbon atoms from carbon dioxide and put them together one by one by one by one by one by one to produce glucose. Glucose is a 6-carbon compound. So ultimately, I'm going to need 6 molecules of carbon dioxide in order to make glucose. And I'm going to take those 6 carbon atoms, I'm going to take the energy, I'm going to take the energized electrons, and put them all together to make this food molecule. Okay, so photosynthesis is a 2-step process. Can't resist. We need to focus on step number 1 in this slide, and then we'll focus on step number 2 in the next slide. Step number one, we said, involved light harvesting. It's called the light-dependent reaction. Now, that makes sense because it depends upon the presence of sunlight. You can't have the light-dependent reaction unless you've got sunlight. Now, details. We said that water is our source of electrons. So water yields electrons. Now, in order to get the electrons out of a water molecule, we need to take the water molecule apart. Now, you guys know that water is composed of hydrogen and oxygen. If I want those electrons, what I'm going to do is I'm going to split the water into its component parts. Now, one of the products made is oxygen. So you'll notice that oxygen is being released from factory number one over there. You all learned that plants make oxygen. This is why plants make oxygen. They use water as a source of electrons. They split the water to get the electrons, and oxygen is produced and released. So that light energy contained in the sun is going to be used to energize those electrons, and the light energy is absorbed by those pigments that we talked about not too long ago, and we use that light energy to energize those electrons, and those energized electrons are going to be used to make two energy-rich compounds, ATP and NADPH. Now, you'll notice on the far right-hand side of the illustration there that ATP and NADPH are heading somewhere. We're going to take those two energy-rich compounds and we're going to send them to factory number two, which is called the light-independent reaction. So, summary, absorbing light energy, energizing electrons, cranking out oxygen, cranking out energy-rich compounds to send to the second step of photosynthesis. So let's wrap this up with step number two. You'll notice what I've done is I've illustrated step number two on this particular slide, and I see that this is the process that we call carbon fixation. Now, I'll remember that means taking in 6 carbon atoms and welding them together, bonding them together to create a molecule of glucose. In order to do that, I need the input of energy that I collected in step number one. So I've got 6 carbon dioxides input, 6 carbon atoms coming in. I have an input of energy from step number one, remember, in the form of ATP and something called NADPH, 2 energy-rich compounds. They contain the energy found in the sunlight that we absorbed in step number one, and put those carbons together with those energized electrons, and I can make one molecule of glucose. And that glucose molecule can be used to make ATP. And the ATP made can be used to fuel the life of the plant, fuel the growth of the plant, fuel the reproduction of the plant, but perhaps more importantly, fuel the life, growth, and reproduction of the animals who eat that plant and the animals who eat those animals. So I see that the process of photosynthesis is really foundational to the life and well-being of all organisms in the ecosystem.